Welcome back, Micah Wizards of the World, for our third release from the archive for free all over the YouTube, in which you are now seeing, is our video recorded several years back where Tyler and I explore substrate composition. Everything from raw sawdust and how we used to use it all the way through to adding in some pelletized nitrogen materials like soy hulls and wheat middlings, on through to the combo pellet. We sort of explore it all and talk about it in relation to your farm, scale, size, and the actual cost associated with doing these things. From the manual labor behind moving and manipulating actual raw sawdust to the simplicity and ease of utilizing something like a combo pellet. These things can make sense for different farms in various ways. So, as we release this third archive footage for free, do check out micahwizards.com. Last week we released speed mixing, and this week we will release knock, seal, and shake, sort of bookmarking two parts of the substrate production that this episode, now released for free, has in common with one another. Check it out now, all at micahwizards.com.
Bad people. It is a bad thing.
That is a nice mug, though.
It is
really cool.
Yeah, it's fucking dope, man.
I'll admit, too, that's a pretty cool mushroom design.
Who did it? I don't know. Do you know? It might be capturing Charles Manson's eyes more than ours. Like, I can see the little square thing going down under his eyes. It's pretty great. It's like,
oh yeah, he's in focus the whole time.
Which would just be funny, actually. So.
Do one of those things where you make his mouth the one that's talking.
Right.
Yeah.
Why has nobody done that yet? We need to get on it. Shit. Okay. All right. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about, I don't know if media is the right word. Oh, shit. Hi, I'm Tyler Crawford.
I'm Eric Lohman, or I'm Edna.
Welcome to the Micah Wizards Deep Dives.
Episode 4.
Is it? Oh, shit. I think it is. Yeah. Wow. All right. We're going to talk about what I hope to call media or substrate. How do you spell it? Is it that cubular?
Yeah, you pronounce it always substrate.
Right, but it's at substrat.
Substratum.
All right. I think,
Ingredients, raw materials.
yeah, ingredients. Right. Oh shit! I don't like this blue pen. This is judging me a little bit too heavily. Looking in, man. Oh, look at that!
Nice.
And then you can like cube it out.
Yeah.
This is very like 80s. Look out! It's a lightning bolt.
Sweet.
Sick, dude. All right, so the shit you're mixing. That's the shit. We want to go through. We're going to cover recruiting mixtures.
Yeah, pros and cons of different ingredients, different ratios, sourcing considerations.
Yeah.
Whole 9 yards.
Everybody is very well acquainted with this, like the master's mix.
Right.
I still need to know where that came from. I have my theories.
You mean the name?
The master mix or masters mix.
No, something about it's the best.
Master. That's true. I mean, both you and I were around long before the soy hull revolution.
Right before that was the default.
Right.
And
you who don't know,
it's
50-50 is the master's mix.
Right. It's very American.
It's very American.
Soy, you know.
Holy shit, it is American.
It's like the most American thing ever.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yeah, people in Europe had, like when I was there, this was completely foreign to them. They still do like more cereal grain based recipes for everything, not just shiitake.
Yeah.
And lower supplementation, kind of slow and gentle approach to how your mycelium grows.
Right.
Whereas in a very American fashion, master's mix is just like really hot, to use that word from the last episode.
It boils.
It's really high, it's very high yielding, but it's also harder to manage. And I think, you're probably about to say this, but like, there's a lot of good reasons to do this. We do this for pretty much everything. But it's important to know why, and it's important to know your alternatives, and it's important to not just view this as like a static input for the rest of time, because these are still raw materials and availability is going to change. Your approach might change.
Yeah, there's already a limited supply of both of these things,
Yeah.
especially like oak,
Yeah, it's like, I don't know. Sometimes people get, mushroom farming's a lot of more the engineering mind, as much as it is biological, but you're still farming and you need to know how to do these, grow mushrooms in a variety of ways, no matter what circumstances are foisted upon you. If you can't get soy, you need to know what to do.
True. But anyways, that's Master's Mix, I guess. Yeah, we do it. I don't know. It works pretty well with everything. What does it not work well with? It's like shiitakes.
There's some where, shiitake, maitake are probably the two biggest ones.
Yeah.
Neither of them do particularly well with that much soy in particular. There's some others where you can kind of go either way with it, and there's pros and cons.
True.
Some more kind of relatively obscure stuff.
Yeah.
Like beech.
Right.
I've seen a lot of people do lower supplement.
Yeah, I think that there's like a bunch of fancy mixes coming out. Like the goat mix definitely came from Mossy Creek, which is just straw pellets. A lot of this stuff is pellets. Pellets are just easy to get. But it's always this combination of like a carbon and a nitrogen, and to what degree the nutrients and the proteins and the different things that are in them are actually of any value.
Right.
Welcome,
Yeah, I was talking to Brad Coons, shout out. Brad, very smart guy. And we were talking about soy and as it pertains to shiitake. And long story short, he was riffing on how the actual carbon to nitrogen ratio in soy hulls is actually not that much higher than other supplements like wheat middlings. But something about, I can't remember what, and I'm not sure he knows specifically either, something about the bioavailability of it is so radically different that it has this, very different metabolic properties for different species.
Yeah.
So things behave radically different, and it just seems to be much more bioavailable with soy than wheat middlings, which are very gentle.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's crude protein. It's like fiber protein. There's a bunch of like different things in there, and the makeup of the actual, I think, cellular like structure of soy hulls just makes it, hot.
Yeah, right. But important to take a broad view here. Eric just wrote down carbon, nitrogen. If you can grow these mushrooms just on, a much more carbonaceous growing medium, aka just sawdust. But obviously, trying to maximize your yield, you want to dial in the ideal amount of supplementation to boost up your nitrogen, which means things will grow faster and you'll get a higher yield.
Oh shit.
Come on.
Gotta be a shoe dog at least every And plus, you got to correct the sign because I think I put it upside down.
Oh, dude.
No, I didn't. No, carbon and nitrogen, I think, are the balance of like most soil-based growing medias.
Yeah, there's obviously a million other micronutrients that all matter to some extent, and some of it's beyond our current knowledge. But in farming in general, this is what a lot of it boils down to. Veggie farming, obviously, phosphorus and potassium, right, are the other two things. But these are the two basic
like I know.
NPK, right?
NPK. Potassium, nitrogen, and carbon. No. What's the K? K is potassium. Shit, we got potassium. We got, what's the P? Phosphorus.
Yeah.
And then nitrogen?
Yeah.
There you go.
But anyways, you want to kind of dial in the ideal balance between these two things for what you're growing and how you want to grow it. What kind of qualities you want to emphasize in your cultivation, aka speed, metabolic stability, yield, all these things you can kind of emphasize more or less depending on what recipe you go with.
That's true. And like in most mushroom cultivation, carbon, like being the starting point, is always going to be something that has low nitrogen, but it has nitrogen in it. So even sawdust like has nitrogen in it. You know, it's got saps, it's got different sort of things happening. So it's got its own CN ratio. But usually when we separate these things, we always call sawdust like a carbon.
Right.
And you would always call a nitrogen whatever you're adding in or your supplementation. So wheat middling, soy hulls, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So everything has both, but it's just in shorthand, shuck tuck.
Even things like everybody using hemp herd, right? Hemp herd is not a fucking,
or even
it's
oats.
not nitrogen, right?
Yeah, oats are kind of the same way, right?
Oats have a ton of carbon, but they also have a fair amount of nitrogen. Oats are interesting. This is like a quick tangent, but there was something online this morning where somebody was comparing hydration of oats for spawn, and it was like 40% hydration and 50% hydration, and getting it up to 50 is pretty ballsy, but it can do it. You know, it's got like that thin wall.
Yeah.
So, anyways, we're not talking about spawn. Fuck off. No. I mean, we are. We will. So I don't know. I split it like this, where you have these things that are pretty common base and easy to source, sawdust and straw, right? And then you have your what's applicable for your nitrogen or your percentage of supplementation. So this is anything from soy hulls to wheat mids.
Yeah.
This is the list for this is a lot longer.
Yeah. And if you go international, that's where things start to get like very strange from our North American standpoint, like for instance, in a lot of poor countries, or in more arid countries, people might be growing every damn thing on straw.
Right. Straw and rice bran.
Yeah, like I know that's the case in Spain, for example, which is a big mushroom producing place, but it's obviously
in China,
much drier.
Particle board.
Old toys.
99% deforested China. Okay, I'm done. Sorry. Yeah, it's old toys. Clearly, you've been fucking with compost all day. The list for this is huge too, like beet pulp, hulls, like whatever. Yeah, it's a huge area.
Yeah.
For some reason, these two have linked up because of they're mentioned in like growing gourmet medicinal mushrooms, soy hulls, and sawdust. I know TR and a few other people started doing like heavy experimentation in the soil sawdust thing.
Yeah.
And that became like an all-around media that everybody was really comfortable using, mostly because it was really sourceable.
Yeah, well, soy is what the number 2 biggest crop in North America or something like that.
And it's like majority exported.
And then most of the hulls were previously, and to this day, still the vast majority are used just for animal feed. So there's a lot of availability, and up until recently, a relatively low valuation on them, right? So
totally.
That's changed a lot, but
it has, and I don't think it's got anything to do with us, which is really interesting. I think the mushroom industry would like to take a lot of credit.
Yeah.
But it's not us.
Yeah. Bigger macroeconomic stuff.
It's huge. It's so interesting. And it also comes with like weather patterns. And I know this is like a tangent, but like anything else, if the grass and grain, right? If it rains heavily in a season and all the cows are eating for free, grain prices drop like a motherfucker.
Yeah, I mean,
soy,
that's like regardless of what you're sourcing, it's important to consider that stuff. Like these aren't just bits that you're buying and it's going to be always available. Like it's something on like buy online or something.
No,
you got to think about what are the conditions for that crop. And how are they looking for that year? And when's the right time to buy? Like, what's the commodity price on it? Is right now the opportune time for you to shell out a bunch of dough and you're going to thank yourself later when availability is low because there was a drought or whatever?
Yeah, and you never know. Just because it's raining in fucking Washington State, Alex, doesn't mean that it's actually like, yeah, son of a bitch. You always get your fucking rain. Doesn't mean that it's fucking raining in the, I don't know, wherever, the Midwest.
Right.
It's probably freezing and snowing and everybody's dying down in Texas, but whatever. Poor Jordan. Yeah, so I think like the grander picture is like when you're sourcing carbon and nitrogen, it becomes predominantly important that you develop a supply chain and you sort of stick with it, whatever it is, and you diversify it and you make sure that you have multiple sources.
Yeah.
Just because we sell combo pellets, and I'm like not saying we're the only people doing it because people have really copycatted on this thing, is like go find another supply. They might not be the same quality because we're the shit.
Well, we even have multiple sources for that. Yeah, which I mean, it could be better, but that's still some redundancy, and we would have ideas of what to do if availability was limited.
That's true.
And everyone should. You shouldn't just have one plan.
No, you got to have multiples. I remember when we first started, Christopher and I were like, "Oh shit, we need like 4 sawdust suppliers, like immediately." Yeah. And it was hard enough to just find one.
Right. Yeah.
Man, I still never sent you over to catch up with Frank, the lobster trap man.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's the guy who like will shoot you on site or whatever.
Something like that. Yeah. You got to be careful where you're sourcing this shit from. Basically, we had this guy that was giving us sawdust, and if you drive by his spot, it's essentially like this giant pile of red oak and this building disappearing behind it and tons of junky cars and a fucking single skid steer that this 400-pound, almost agoraphobic human can sit in. And fucking we pay this dude Scott to go get the sawdust and drop it off because he's got this relationship. Yeah. And we're like, give Frank some mushrooms. He's curious. So, what a 5-pound box of fucking mushrooms look like. Raw mushrooms. Need I say it again?
Oh, this is the guy who just ate them raw, right?
He just hands it to Frank, and Frank goes, "Oh!" and just starts stuffing 5 pounds of raw mushrooms into his fucking face, in his skid steer. Can't strap him in. Seatbelt's too small. The fucking mushroom box is holding him against the fucking controls, and he's just gnawing away. He's like, "Holy shit! You tell those guys that was good mushrooms." Terrifying. I hope Frank never sees
my
this.
stomach would fucking explode.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I bet he lives on a diet of like small children and soy holes and red oak sawdust. So.
Yeah, cool.
He's probably a great guy. All right, tangent.
Multiple sources.
Carbon. You can't just have one Frank. All right. Sawdust is an interesting one though, because most of the world's red oak, in particular, that's what we use, is like, or I should say in the States, red oak is very slim. It like goes down the middle of the States, down into like Brazil. It's like a slim area where the majority is produced. I should say produced, the majority is harvested and grown.
Right.
So straw, the same thing. You can kind of grow straw everywhere. Maine is like 90% straw cultivation. You go up to the county.
Right. Yeah, most places are growing some kind of grain in any society, right? So you can usually get straw.
Yeah, I'd love to see
straw stuff. Other places where other types of oak are easier to get. Or something else entirely. Like, say again, from my time in Belgium, they grew everything on beech because that's the predominant hardwood that's available. So everything's grown on beech.
Yeah, it's true. And then out west, you guys just used alder, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you got to pick your sort of scene and get into it. The complicated thing is when you start looking at hardwoods versus softwoods, and we'll sort of get into that. But is that carbon nitrogen? Should we wrap up any more of that in a bow and a pretty bow?
Well, there's no like magic formula, but like maybe we should talk about like just a general concept of what are typical ratios.
All right, I'll take the bow off. All right, fine. All right, so you have these sort of like very non-discriminant things like master's mix being 50% and 50%.
Yeah.
That's when you're using soy
Wow. This blue one's fucking failing on me, man.
We gotta freshen it up next time.
That's true. For you guys.
Different colors.
So soy and sawdust becoming the primary thing here, 50-50. That works for things like, oysters, pepinos.
Almost everything.
Yeah. Yeah, you name it, it works for it. The list is shorter that it doesn't work with, so let's just do that. How about that?
Right, sure. So shiitake's the big one.
Yeah.
Maitake, it doesn't really work well. It's not as obvious as with shiitake.
You can still grow some great maitakes with this.
You tend to see some weirder things, like the fruit, like the morphology might be a little off.
Yeah.
And also they tend to mold.
Yeah, you'll see this funny thing happen. We'll save this for a maitake episode. But in all reality, it gets funny. Yeah, there's quarreling, all sorts of shit.
And then, like I said earlier, there's some varieties where, some people prefer to grow them on master's mix, and some people have good reasons why they don't. That would include like lion's mane would be the big one that's kind of you can argue either perspective.
Right, lion's kind of, if you bring that down 40-30%, you're in a better range. Right. Even with these two, if you drop that, TR, I know the recipe, what you tell people it is. You can drop the soy and increase the dust and add in some other things.
Yeah, and you're gonna have an entirely different incubation experience.
Right. There's such a thing as like too dense of a substrate too, and this is quite dense if your sawdust isn't coarse enough. So if you have like powdery sawdust, or if you have like, I should say not powdery sawdust, but super powdery soy, it creates these weird like textural issues within the block. So you won't get an even, mix. Therefore you end up with all sorts of weird things happening towards the bottom of the bag versus the top of the bag.
Right.
It's weird. Similar with straw too, but
and it can't breathe that well.
Yeah. So this can get complicated if you're kind of trying to source these things out there, which we'll get into. But percentages, that's like the biggest thing for that master's mix side of things.
Right. And again, that's like, it should always be pointed out that that's like the most aggressive type of recipe that's really used. Maybe there's examples in other parts of the world that are as aggressive. But most stuff is like what in North America we use for shiitake, most notably pretzel.
Well, if you don't eat your fucking pretzels, let's be honest, the world will run out of wheat middlings as well as wheat bran.
Right.
Or so the fine folks down in Pennsylvania told me. I tend to believe them. I mean, I'm like, I literally called it. It was McGeary's. McGeary's is this great spot in this area. Yeah. And maybe they're not anymore, but they were like the go-to for organic shit.
Right.
And I forget his name. Stupid name.
Scott?
Oh, maybe it wasn't that stupid. I don't know. Yeah. But I just called him and he was like, y'all ain't eating your pretzels. And he was just like losing it. And I was like, this is the guy who would never call you back, right?
When I would talk to him, he would just start talking to me about his barbecues and how much he loves mushrooms. And
everybody gets our millet from us. You want some millet? We have lots of millet. I was like, Jesus. All right.
Let me tell you about these barbecued shiitakes. Oh my God. But anywho, most substrate recipes and the one that's typically used for shiitake and maitake is more along these lines. Much lower supplementation rate.
Much lower.
I guess a general rule is that this often applies to the stuff that's really, really slow. So, maitake is not as slow as shiitake when it comes to how long it takes to do its full colonization, but it develops in vitro for a really long time. Shiitake, of course, takes ages for its full cycle until fully browned.
There's a lot in the sourcing of this stuff in particular, because you'll have certain wheat mids that are like super, super rich. Because mids are not a product necessarily. They're not a thing. They're not part of a wheat plant. Let's say. They're just the scrapings, literally, from like the fucking floor.
Right.
So mills are dusty, dirty joints, and they basically just collect that shit and they put it into a thing that's called mids. Whereas bran is more like a flaky component of a wheat milling process.
Right.
So this is just the dog shit that comes from making the bran shit.
So they're not the same.
You're not the same. You're not the same. In fact, bran is pretty rich. I think why we, as well as a bunch of other places, started moving towards mids, like Mark was like, what the fuck are mids? You know, and somebody kept mentioning them, and we were like, all right, we can get mids. We can't get bran for some reason. But the price discrepancy like 5 years ago was so extraordinary. Like a bag of mids is $10 and a bag of bran is $50. You're
right.
Like, fuck, 50.
Yeah.
So, those are not the same thing, and they should be kind of treated differently. And you should experiment.
Yeah, and if you're, this kind of applies to everything, but if you're using a new source for any ingredient, it's always good to like go into a testing phase when you first get it for a while and figure out if it's comparable or radically different from what you've used in the past. Anywho, that's another typical ratio. Those are like the two, the 50-50 for like oysters, and 70 to 80% dust, 20 to 30% wheat, or some other things, rice, bran, and what have you, or even soy. Those are the two typical ratios that you're going to see most often in cultivation.
Things that I don't see that I don't think a lot of people should use is like soy. Is it soy pulp or soy cakes? It's like basically disregarded soy. So it's a little weird.
Oh yeah, that's very different. And that carbon nitrogen ratio.
Yeah.
For like, are you talking about like soybean meal? Like,
yeah.
That stuff's like really, really high in nitrogen.
Yeah.
So you gotta be wicked careful.
Yeah, man. Never go over 50% with soy. I think people have even experimented, Brad being one of them, of like how many percentages can you go down at? Like 43%. It's the same technical yield as 50%, but there becomes some discrepancies in there in terms of like, once again, how you cook the substrate and what you inoculate it with, the whole 9 yards. So 50-50 is just easy. It's interesting. It's simple. Americans are simple.
Yep. And as far as making money, you get a much higher yield.
That's true. I guess sawdust we should go into, because, you know, that's like a very interesting issue. Wondering who's going to go buy on a motorcycle. Nobody. Sawdust is this strange sourcing issue, and it really is the first primary ingredient if you're going to make like blocks, right? So you have to find a source for it. And if you don't have a source, a lot of people trend towards hardwood fuel pellets or combo pellets now. So you kind of have 3 major categories. You have raw dust. I like calling it raw. Instead of saying raw dog, you just say raw dust. And then you have your hardwood fuel pellets. I don't know why my accent's decided to kick in right now. And then all of a sudden you got that combo pellets. Now I just sound like, what's his name from, Jesus Christ, Kurt Russell. Thank you. Well, isn't that right?
Cottonwood.
So you kind of have like two major ways to get sawdust. You can go to a mill and you can source it directly from the actual like mills that are milling the trees, or you can go to somebody like a furniture factory and they're basically milling kiln-dried planks.
Right,
you know?
right, yeah.
So this splits into like 2 different categorical sides first, which is, you get kiln-dried or you get fresh. These things have to be treated like totally different products.
Yeah, or formerly fresh, which we'll get into, but stuff that's already composted.
Right. Also, fresh even splits off into composted, or
like, I don't know,
fermented, so to speak.
Yeah. Or like genuinely fresh, like brand new.
See, I'm just gonna put a star there. See that star?
Special
Special.
dust.
Yeah, it's just taking fresh and just doing it, and adding nutrients to it as opposed to like composting, but getting off topic here. That becomes a sourcing issue. So you got to figure out where you're going to get it from. How pure is it? One, species or another.
Right.
Is there softwoods thrown in there? If you throw softwoods into this mixture and then compost it or mix it fresh or whatever, you're going to end up with this sort of like, I'm going to call this continued fresh. It looks better.
Nice.
Right? All right. Fuck it. I don't know. You run into all these issues if softwoods get into your raw sawdust supply that is primarily
just species depending, and then sometimes the people who you're sourcing from they don't know a damn thing about matching the right substrate for your mushrooms, and they're not going to understand the
importance of
the fact that it's actually going to screw you over if there's a bunch of cedar thrown in there or something like that.
Yeah, these aromatic woods have fucking antifungals in them. They want to snipe out your mycelium and kill it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. To varying extents, So like we'll get into, people out west and elsewhere growing on softwoods with no issue at all.
Right.
It really depends on the species and the context and all that.
As well as the processing and stuff,
Right.
So if you took kiln-dried like pine or Doug fir and tried to process it, you'd end up with a little bit less of like a yield and success rate.
Right.
Whereas if you took kiln-dried and pelletized Doug fir and you actually processed it with a hardwood or whatever, then you kind of end up with something that will yield just not as well. And it does run into other issues, but it is rendering the actual carbon or sort of availability of that softwood into basically a benign carbon, so you can just use it.
Right.
But it's not the best. So that's raw sawdust. We'll go into that a little more
greater
in a second.
Yeah.
Hardwood fuel pellets, the same thing. You're usually getting like, I don't know, 80% to 90% hardwood. And then you're usually getting 10 to 20% softwood. And the reason they do this for the majority of pellet mills is a binding issue. And it's not a binding issue in the way that you think. So a lot of like things go around this conversation basically, but they're only using it because the dyes and the actual machinery that they use can't produce as much power to just supply hardwood as a primary pelletization force. So like when you're pushing all the sawdust through the dyes, you have to have a pretty large industrial size, like horsepowered engine to be able to do that. And it fucks up a lot of dyes and runs them really hot if it's 100% hardwood. But if you throw in softwoods, it basically like, softens the dye extrusion rate, and it just allows the pellets to flow a lot more evenly. That's a fact.
I didn't know that. It's fascinating.
That's why like they put that in, but that's also why soy hulls are a great thing to mix in.
Right.
Because most of these pellet mills are just running soy hulls through to actually clean their dyes out.
That's fascinating. I always thought it was just like for like cheap economic reasons. Like that's interesting.
It's because it will fuck up the machines, because all of these pellet mills that were built like 20 years ago never sized their shit correctly originally.
Okay.
It's like a large different sort of issue.
So did it turn out to be like music to their ears when the combo pellet thing got proposed?
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, that's really easy to pull off.
We never knew about it until one of the mills was basically like, oh yeah, we use soy basically to fucking clean and hone our dyes.
That's crazy.
Like, really?
Cool.
Because it's a lubricant, and same thing with softwoods. It has different properties compared to hardwoods. So, yeah. There's all sorts of pellet companies making fucking hardwood specific pellets, oak pellets, 100% oak for barbecue shit. Yeah, that's another thing where they're actually upgrading their equipment. Blah blah blah. I don't know why I'm telling the world about the pellet industry, but it's fascinating.
It's interesting. Yeah,
it's cool, right? And then the combo pellets are the other side, where like us as an entity, or if you can trust another entity, be careful. produces exactly what we want in the pellets, which if it's a 50-50 blend, or in the case of our wheat mids or stockade blends, it's 70-30. We just make the mixture, and through the actual pelletization process have different mixture methods in which the substrate is ground to the exact consistency that we're after, goes through the milling process, gets pelletized, comes out. It's good, shelf stable. It's where it's at.
And each pellet's pretty much exactly at that ratio through that process.
Yeah,
right.
It's off by like 1%, maybe.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
so
the fundamentals different quality than just mixing pellets that are one and the other.
Yeah.
It leads to entirely like a different processing routine when you're actually making your blocks.
Yeah, there was like a huge push for a while where people were like, I'll just get soy hull pellets and hardwood fuel pellets. And now soy pellets are almost impossible to get, primarily because of the sourcing issues. It's not our fault. It's not our fault. It's not your fault.
Blame it on the cows
Blame it
or
on
something,
the cows.
right?
Blame it on the rain.
Yeah.
Blame it on the sun. Isn't that a Stevie Wonder song? Might be.
Don't know.
Anyways.
Hey, question for you, since you're the pellet expert. With hardwood fuel pellets,
Yes.
and there's always this notion of binders.
Yeah.
Are there other common binders besides just softwoods?
Starch.
Right.
So like they'll typically, if they're trying to run hardwood through a pelletizing machine and they don't have the power in their actual like process, I mean the literal like engine power, they'll add in things like starch, or they'll add in, you know, other weird forms of sugars to basically just get the things to bind, because these things are being extruded through basically a plate with a bunch of fucking holes in it, you know. And the way in which they're not square, by the way, I'm just drawing it square. Sawdust is like forced down into these things, or the mixture, and then it basically gets pressed and extruded down. So the heat and the pressure that this produces based on friction is an insane amount, but sometimes it's not high enough, so you have to throw in a binder. So this is why, like, if you get an at-home pellet mill and you try to make your own pellets, you can keep the moisture content a little bit higher, because the moisture is actually what's creating the, like, you know, pellet shape.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
not the fact that, you know, you're creating a pellet, you're just creating a shape.
Right.
Therefore they'll mold fuckers.
Yeah.
Like we threw 70% you know, hydrated 70% moisture content, it was 60 to 70% oak through a pelletizer, and it forms pellets. But they'll break, they'll mold, they're extremely absorbent to water.
Yeah.
When they create hardwood fuel pellets, or when we create combo pellets, we're getting them down to 7% moisture content, which nothing fucking can grow in there.
Right.
It's dead to the world.
That's even just as a reference point from the grain world. That's lower than like actual like professionally processed grains from a grain mill. Those typically are at, like, depending on the grain in question, like 10 to 12%.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Which those, you know, they're dry. They feel completely dry. So
yeah, I mean that's fucking low, man. I it's strange to like consider this pelletization thing on a lot of different levels, because it does take a hell of a lot of infrastructure, and that's why primarily if you can't source raw dust, you're going to go towards hardwood fuel pellets. But as more combo pellet people come online with more variations in what they offer, it just makes it easier. So
right.
those are the three major ways to get sawdust. I think we should like go into the raw dust.
Yeah, start with raw and then we'll just proceed.
Yeah. So raw dog and dust. Basically, depending upon what you're getting, you have like a mixture versus a single whatever. So you have Far West fungi, right? Far West gets like probably
an amalgamation of all
like
kinds of wood, right?
a dozen different varieties of hardwood, and that's primarily what they're using as a raw component to their inputs. And then you have somebody like us 5 years ago,
right.
It was just 100% oak dust.
Yeah.
So there's a couple different differentiations there, but basically when you're using raw sawdust, there are two different ways to use it, and I hope that somebody gives me shit for this, but let's see. It got somebody kicked off the CMGN, who shall remain nameless, right? But not in a bad way. Just the arguments get heated, I guess. If you're using raw sawdust immediately versus I'm gonna say composted or turned dust, you end up with two very different results. This one over time stabilizes a little bit, whereas this one goes through these like pretty rapid swings if you're trying to like keep it dry and keep it inside. So the interesting thing about it is you're not ending up with a rampant moisture content change as well as a varying, CN change, especially as the pile sort of like just sits there. All the moisture is going to sort of fall to the middle and the center. The outside sort of dries slowly. So the point of having raw sawdust and actually composting it, because it does have nitrogen in it, which will actively start.
Especially in a gigantic biomass too.
Yeah. Oh man, it gets hot.
Yeah.
And that like in a 33-ton load, if you put your hand like in the center of that shit, you'll be like,
hot.
Fuck.
Yeah.
It's no joke.
Yeah.
So turning a pile becomes like your best means of entry into this like raw dust land. They did that
at Cascadia.
Cascadia.
Yeah. Plus it was outside, so it was also
it
just
gets
like breathing.
Right.
It's out exposed to the elements.
Yeah, so most like farms operate this way. They'll basically just like most big farms prior to 10 years ago, I guess.
Yeah.
Have a big mixer. They have all their sawdust outside, including KSFs, Kennett Square, any of these massive, substrate producers that are using sawdust. They just have fucking piles of oak, and they just turn it every day, and then they load it into mixers. They add their dry ingredients, which actually bring the moisture content closer to reality.
Right.
And then they just bag from there. Yep. Sterilize and so on and so forth.
But yeah, I guess one thing that's important, to a greater extent with like truly raw, fresh dust, to a lesser extent, but still present with stuff that's been aged, the moisture content is going to be way more variable than if you're using something that's pelletized. And so there's all kinds of old school things like the squeeze test and what have you that can work to a point. But if you want to be really thorough, you want to have a solid methodology for actually knowing what the inherent moisture content is that you're starting from.
Yeah.
Don't pretend like it's zero, because everything will, go pretty poorly.
Yeah, it's true. And we should say, like, when you're just using raw dust like we used to back in the day without turning or composting it, because we're in fucking Maine and it freezes, it definitely changes so variable over time that, like, it's indiscriminate whether it's just top or bottom, but good yields, poor yields, good yields, poor yields, good yields, poor yields. And that has to do with a lot of different like issues.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's very hard to manage. So you have to really know what you're dealing with. You have to have, again, a way to measure where your baseline is on any given day.
Yeah.
I mean, there are times when we would add like almost no water at all.
You just add as much.
And again, this is
material.
to
You're
get
like, shit,
to
we gotta
like,
crank up the fucking nitrogen.
especially oak, given its really complex cell structure, can hold on to a shitload of water. And that becomes less and less so as you move from, oak at one end all the way down to softwoods.
Most varieties being like fucking whatever, 62 to 63% moisture content for sawdust based substrate.
Right.
If you're at 70 or 80%, dropping 20% of moisture content's insane.
Yeah. It's kind of nuts how you will have recipes like that or times like that where all you're doing is trying to dry it out, basically. With supplements.
Yeah, composting and turning helps it, in a crazy way. So the issue here is like, does this yield better than this? Infrequently, pretty normalized, Mm-hmm. So you have to treat this just as you would process a pellet or process some other raw ingredient. Otherwise, you really don't know, what's going to happen in this sort of scenario. Many people do this,
Well, also, depending on the, there's obviously going to be a different profile depending on what type of wood you're using or woods. And there's things like tannins that you want to, there are reasons to let those start to leach out over time through the composting process.
If you can find it, a copy of the Shiitake Grower's Handbook by John Donahue.
Right there.
Is it up there? You see it?
Great book.
It might be.
Yeah, might be at the farm.
Fuck.
It's out of print, but it's well worth.
Yeah, it's like $50, but I don't see it up
Yeah.
there. Yeah, it's
Bring
a
it
killer
next
book,
time.
man. Yeah, it's
Should have brought it for the shiitake episode.
It's
like
true.
dummies.
What are we doing? We'll put a link right here.
Watch it. It's right there. No.
Every set for this is going to be different. Just fuck you. No, I don't know. All right.
What was your point though? With,
no, I was just going to say in that Shiitake Grower Handbook, there's a huge sort of conversation about tannic level, about moisture content, raw materials, aging, composting, how you actually sterilize versus dry heat, pasteurize versus regular pasteurize. I mean, this is like published in 88, I think, 89.
pretty old. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an old book, but it's relevant. More relevant than most of the newer books being put out there.
Genuinely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is.
I'm really tired of people writing fucking new mycology books that don't know anything about fucking
Right.
mushrooms.
Yeah,
And
no,
I'm
this
not
is
gonna do
one,
that, but-
speaking from us, this is probably like easily top 5
Yeah,
most
yeah,
informative reads you'll access for
yeah.
mushroom cultivation.
And it gives you more questions than answers, which are good because you have a direction to go and learn. You know, so,
Right. Yeah.
so-
It's actually like empirical, you know?
Yeah, it totally is.
So, all right.
Let's raw
Anything else?
sawdust.
Yeah.
You know,
It can be cheaper, can be a lot easier to get. That's
Fuck
a lot of
yeah,
reasons
man.
why
storage
people
is
use
a
it.
huge issue, though.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Spaces. Yeah. And moisture content.
what is 33 tons, which is like a moving forward tractor trailer truck, takes up approximately, what was that space right there? 50 by 75?
That sounds about right.
I think it was like 50 by 75 that we were putting that in. They're like 25. Yeah, it must have been. If you don't have
It's
that,
like one cell. Yeah.
yeah, and you're in an area like we are, and you're trying to store it inside or outside or turn it or whatever, you need a fucking tractor to get it in and out. You need the labor to do it. It's much more costly than just being like, it's free. I just have to pay for shipping. That is like
Right,
the most
yeah.
foolhardy fucking thing.
The
anybody's ever
handling, the square footage are all
Yeah.
considerations.
Yeah, for sure. And like the amount of pallets that you can fit in there that are 1 ton pallets of dried material, not hydrated,
Yeah,
material.
Because you're not storing water.
Yeah, there is no water.
Right.
It's 70% versus 7%.
Huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah, so whether it's you're using hardwood fuel pellets, you're getting common pellets, you're doing something else, it makes a lot of sense for micro, medium, or even larger scale farms to operate that way. Even Kyle Garoni's coming around. Interestingly enough, I'll leave that there. So sawdust is a bitch, but it can work, and I'm not judging it. Well, yeah, I'm judging it. Are you judging it?
Nope.
Oh, he's not judging it.
Not judging it.
So hardwood fuel pellets then. This became like huge on the Shermery HWFP and then like Facebook and all these weird groups and shit. And it was primarily because nobody knew how to get hardwood, sawdust to actually process. So
Right.
they ended up just finding these hardwood fuel pellets. They don't tell you what percentage of, softwoods are in them or anything like that, but it doesn't necessarily matter. They work.
Kind of obvious. Most people know this, but like the primary economic driver for these is heating. So people don't really give a shit.
And they're like,
What's in their heat, their fuel pellet for their stove. So
no,
Yeah.
you just don't want it to form ash.
Right.
Which is another contributing factor to putting softwood into heating source. It creates more ash than hardwood.
Mhm.
Hardwood burns hotter. That's kind of why they go that route. But these like we said, they're made up of many different things. So it could be, depending upon your area, oak or poplar or cherry, or it doesn't matter. It's
all sorts of
whatever's
stuff make
close
both.
to
Yep.
them,
Yeah.
And then the softwoods vary too. It's not just Doug fir. It's not just whatever pine. Or,
Yeah.
it's all over the place. So you have this like softwood
sort of issue, and those things can definitely create some context yield issues, based on what percentage is in here, but mostly it's like 80+% of hardwoods and then less than 10% of the softwood. But because of the kiln-dried process, it doesn't really matter. Like we were saying, it kills most of the like antimicrobial contents in a softwood, specifically in Doug fir, which is really weird. So you have people out west that are using 100% Doug fir pellets, which is pretty fascinating.
Right, and they're growing stuff on them that is typically very temperamental.
Yeah, really
like shiitake, and they have no problem at all.
Yeah, for sure. So hard to fuel pellets are an option. I think they're a great option. And combo pellets, are the next best thing, and it's us or whatever company that produces these things. And there's a big difference between what people think combo pellets are and what they actually are. They are 100% oak. It's just a single species of oak, single species of hardwood, and soy hulls. So that blend in the actual milling process goes through I think it's 5 or 6 different vortex mixes. So basically gets huffed up and down with air to mix all this stuff after it's brought down to the same exact moisture content. And then it's pulled into, basically dyes extruded out. And then a single pellet is comprised of that 50% soy and 50% whatever oak, or 20-30 or 70-30, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and there's huge advantages in our humble opinions to going about it this way. It's also worth pointing out, there's 400 something species of oak. This is specifically red oak, which is far less dense than say white oak, and obviously easier to obtain.
So another thing that John Donahue book goes into is the cellular structure of oak.
Yeah. Like if you were growing old school log shiitakes, growing on white oak is pretty dope. But in the case of massive volumes for the pelletization process, red oak grows faster and is easier to obtain. And it's generally the less dense oaks are, it's easier to release their nutrient value and get a higher yield faster. Whereas if you're going for a long-term sustainability, denser, something like a white oak is the way to go.
Yeah, for sure. But there's also, there's this difference between, were you around when we got, was it I think it was deemed uncrushed versus crushed soy hulls?
Oh, yeah.
So let's go back to raw fucking issues, right? So you have, let's just say you're trying to soy some soys. Did you soy your soy hulls today, kid? You have uncrushed, crushed
pelletized, right?
The same thing goes for fucking cottonseed hulls, for instance. Obviously, they look a little bit different, but uncrushed have this curvature bowl structure, and essentially they look like half pellets or half BBs or something. They're extremely tough, and if you mix those into a regular sawdust, like a pretty coarsely ground sawdust, you end up not making it as available to the mushroom mycelium, but also it can't hold as much moisture content.
Right.
So you end up with a lot of issues when you just source that.
Yeah, exactly. And you can end up with anaerobic blocks really easily if you just treat it the same way.
Yeah, especially for pasteurizing. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And getting them to actually soak up any water requires a lot of time. That's, I think, what we discovered. We had to use them.
Yeah, crushed essentially throws them through a hammer mill and you get fucking...
a relatively coarse...
Yeah. It's like sawdust mix, basically.
Yeah, and that stuff's much more homogenized, obviously, and will soak up water pretty quickly.
Yeah, probably crushes one of these up into 6 or 7, little shreds, which are ideal. And then crushes them, pelletizes them.
And then they become very dense. It's worth pointing out. And in order to actually get those to pulverize, at least in our experience, back in the day when all of our blocks were used or produced using helix mixers. We used to have to dump in like almost all the water required for a given mix.
Yeah, because they just hold their shape forever until they're beaten to shit. Yeah, they're just tough.
So we dump in the soy holes, and then pretty much all the water that was ultimately going to be added, more or less, to that recipe.
And it just
to get them to actually break down. Otherwise, you're in the same problem as what we talked about with uncrushed, where you're going to have a bunch of soy that just didn't soak up any water at all, and then your carbon source is going to be too wet, and everything's going to be screwy.
Yeah, and without hindering and just like harping on the fucking combo pellet point, oak makes it easier for them to break up, like a lot easier. The interesting part about raw soy pellets too is rats love them. Fucking little furry bastards. Oh, that looks like a turtle rat with a really long tail. Sorry for that. Man, I suck at drawing these days.
No,
it's not bad.
Better than I could do.
He's just scurrying with his little fucking weird feet.
He's hungry.
He's just like, give me the fucking soy pellet! But for some reason, when you actually mix sawdust into that shit, the rats just like forget where the fuck they are. They kill themselves. Self-immolation. Oftentimes you'll see rats burning themselves. It's
protest the Vietnam War.
It's fucking nuts, man.
They convert to Buddhism.
Yeah. Simultaneously, they defenestrate a lot. They jump out of tall windows.
And then, or seppuku.
Oh, seppuku. Right.
Yeah. They're Japanese.
3 different ways in which rats will kill themselves when you put sawdust inside. And that's in particular because this combo pellet is just their mortal fucking enemy. It's great.
Yeah.
It's not their kryptonite.
Right. And that becomes a huge thing when you're, if you're in a warehouse and you're there for a long time, because you become known as a prime food source.
And then all of your employees just walk around with guns all day. There was Damon the other day. Were you back there when he set up?
No, but
we had a few rats scurrying around, and he had set up in the back after we made these like racks for all of our pallets of grain to sit on. Right. And he was just waiting for him. And like 10 minutes later, he leaves. He backs up, and I just see a rat go. Bloop. He's like, motherfucker, So all of us mushroom farms have 22s for fun. Kind of like that.
Yeah, maybe rats will be deserving of their own episode someday, but it's a serious war.
It is a war
because they will rip through anything.
They don't give a shit. They hit through concrete.
Yeah, they literally
metal.
bored holes through the walls of our warehouse trying to get at our grain.
And we have a fucking solid line of defense now.
Yeah, but it's taken a long time.
It's taking a moment. Yeah.
Anyway,
dead fucking rats are the only rats. So that's an advantage to combo pellets, but in all reality, I think that you kind of have to consider like how much you're storing, how much you have the ability to turn equipment wise if you're using raw sawdust, and how you're actually making bags. It might be easier.
What's your
bags?
What's your mixing equipment and infrastructure that you have?
Yeah. What else do we have on this crazy list of shit?
Well,
should we just chat about this?
Let's mention, I think this is really key, and it's underestimated by people until you actually have some practical hands-on experience with it, is if you're using just the processing benefits of the combo pellets.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
This
just becomes a combo pellet episode.
A big advertisement.
Sorry. We've made it this far. We're trying to help everybody, damn it.
So yeah, like regardless of if you're using, say, raw dust and soy holes, or if you're using pelletized hardwood fuel pellets and pelletized soy, the amount of processing time to actually get that stuff to break down and homogenize and absorb all that water is much more intensive. And it just takes longer and more effort than, with these combo pellets. It is really amazing how they start to swell up and dissolve when water's introduced, literally immediately. It takes like 10 seconds and that whole thing's broken down into a nice fluffy medium.
Yep.
So the amount of like labor and effort required, even if they might be a little bit more expensive than some other options, the amount of, ultimately money and effort that you're saving by the fact that all you have to do is add water and then they're like pretty much good to go is huge.
That's insane. And there's no waste, like in using pelletized, if you're using, combos or anything else, you can just leave them in dry hoppers. Despite what douche tits McGee Eric Myers says, like, you don't need a metal hopper. You just need a fucking wooden hopper, like the affordability doesn't have to match up with the equipment that you're actually putting out there to make these things work. Fucking mixers are now like 30 grand.
Yeah.
They were like $8 grand when we got a 2-yard mixer.
Right.
$30,000 for a mixer. Like,
insane.
It's too much, man. Spend your money on a fucking boiler, Yeah. I don't know. We could harp all day on the combo pellet thing, but the reality is we're trying to create a supply chain and a line for the availability of it, as are a few other companies out there.
Right.
Which is great. So if we can make it work, we will. But you mentioned this morning, like, experimentation, as well as like coming up with alternative mixes. This is really important for spawn, but also for substrate, is like trying to define, what works, what doesn't work, what might work for a little while, primarily because you're trying to decide what happens when you lose a source of supply chain.
Right. And what's feasible for you too,
Yeah.
like for instance, not that cap and stem's like really even close to the biggest thing in terms of scale, but we're still pretty, we produce a lot of blocks. So to try to ask, a pretty large crew that's making those blocks, and as, new people are kind of cycling in and out, pretty quickly, to have this complex mix to manage is not really viable. Whereas, for example, our buddy Jordan at Texas Fungus, produces less blocks, long story short, and is able to, devote some attention to these pretty cool recipes that he's at least talked to me about. I'm not sure what he's doing at this exact moment in time, but he's using like molasses and all these really cool ingredients. And there are some benefits for him. Like I would imagine in the case of molasses, that's just a bunch of sugar that's really available for something like an oyster to just go buck wild on. But we couldn't ask,
our crew to do it.
Yeah, like you need to put in the molasses,
No, but there's other ways to think about these things too. Like you can dissolve a lot of these things in water from, your calcium sources to whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the advantages to using these pellets and adding pellets and then adding water to get your perfect hydration, right, is that like if you actually have your H2O source in like an IBC container, you can just pipe this shit up and into your water source. And then in here, you can have basically your inputs, calcium, just like any hydroponic system would. Sure, molasses.
Right.
SAS. You can add whatever you want and then pump that shit into there. So
yeah.
there are different ways, but
like I'll riff for a second on the calcium. So one thing that you can do is use calcium carbonate, aka lime, for adjusting pH. If your pH is a little bit off, generally you want to be right around 6.5, more or less, is a good general rule.
Should we write the 2 calciums down?
The 2 most commonly used ones, calcium carbonate. And then calcium sulfate, aka gypsum. Now you want to be careful about what you want to make sure about the actual like chemical purity of what you're sourcing, because there's some pretty funky shit in these. You can buy agricultural lime from somewhere and it's got all kinds of weird stuff in there, heavy metals and arsenic and what have you, and you don't want any of that in there, obviously. And you can also, there's
as pure as you can get from like brewery sources.
Right. And from my understanding with gypsum, there's like different, chemical forms of gypsum. And you want calcium sulfate dihydrate, which is like pure gypsum.
And don't break up a fucking piece of drywall.
Yeah, the point is this stuff gets adulterated depending on their application because these are used in myriad industries all over the world.
Yeah.
So you just want to get the pure stuff. Calcium carbonate is used to adjust pH, which can be really helpful for a healthy growing environment.
Mhm.
And it's also, there's actually a lot of studies that kind of emphasize how calcium carbonate can increase yield, especially with oysters.
Yeah.
And I've seen different amounts, anywhere from like 1 to 4% added to your mix can be really beneficial, and some farms really swear by it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
There's been farms that have been using that stuff forever, and it's becoming a primary interest, which is why I mentioned the water thing, because if you're going to, in line, put the stuff in there, you can get it into your pellets, But these things are worth messing around with, especially because they have abilities to change, substrate pretty easily.
Yeah.
Without having crazy effects, unless you add too much, for instance, and it creates too much heat in the actual colonization process.
right.
That's an issue.
Yeah.
You can make things sticky as opposed to like not if it's in the wrong material.
Yeah. It can get really nuanced. Gypsum can stabilize pH as well. It has that effect. It's like a relatively neutral as long as it's not too heavily hydrated, from my understanding.
Yeah, this is like a pH adjust. This is like a pH buffer, basically. This is why most farms will add gypsum as opposed to calcium carbonate.
Yeah.
So they'll add calcium sulfate to sort of make sure through that colonization process,
Yeah, it stays relatively stable.
Yeah.
And
you should experiment with stuff. You should
and you might have something like, there's, like say up in Maine, like we can source beet pulp for like nothing. Granted, we don't really use it, but like we have, and we've tried it out because it's like it's there and we can get it for a good price point. Or oats would be another thing. Whereas if you're in a different part of the country, you might be able to get rice bran really easily, or
that's true,
something like that. And
West Coast can definitely get rice bran like it's going out of style.
Yeah.
Closer to the Far East.
And you might find something that is easy for you to obtain, and maybe it's cheap too, and it just works really well for you.
One of the most interesting things too to consider, because I'm sure people who are watching this are not just growing, edible gourmets. The psychedelic thing is becoming increasingly interesting in regards to what your legal, from a decriminalized or legalized standpoint, substrate can contain, and it cannot contain shit anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So there is harsh laws. Some of them are even limiting your ability to use peat moss, but you can use core. So there's very particular reasons for that, which are kind of bullshit, but at the same time they're tested for it. There's a lot of crazy litigation issues. So straw and soy for cubensis is a huge thing, straw and mids, straw and whatever nitrogen source you want.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some interesting avenues to go down, even for dung loving edible species that aren't
right. You can get stuff that's often a very like we were talking about with the pelletization process, something that's more of an inert carbon. Like cocoa coir is one of those examples of something. It's just a very bland growing medium.
Oh, it totally is.
You have to then introduce a lot of the nutrients that are going to be required to get a good yield of fruits.
Yeah, and if you can't add shit, you got to add something. So
right.
Yeah.
And then experimentation for species specific reasons. It got really hard to find wheat mids, and we talked about this in the shiitake episode, but that led to a bunch of people to try to figure out how to grow it on soy, because people do it in Asia.
Yeah.
So how are they doing it? And there's a lot of failure, but there are some successes.
Yeah. It's strain specific. I don't know if people are quite aware of this, but this is something we should talk about before we kind of wrap up, the raw material side. Is something that I've argued about specifically for grant writing or specifically for conversating with farms, is this phenotype substrate combo. It's just sorry about that. Substrate comparison. It's just like a CN ratio. not all phenotypes or strains are going to like a particular substrate. So if you have a new phenotype and you just like found a fucking oyster in the woods, like Dunk did this years ago, found this delicious smelling oyster, and we grew it out on spawn, and then we put it on blocks. It still smelled fucking awesome, but it didn't fruit a goddamn mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
We were just growing it on a hardwood. I don't even know if it was growing on a hardwood. So like you take a wild and you put it into a very like rudimentary monocropped substrate, like 50-50 or anything else.
Sure. Yeah.
You don't
It's
know
not
what you're
always
gonna
gonna.
get.
Yeah. And I think in general, like, oyster cultivation has kind of been the primary driver for this proliferation of small mushroom farms. And people sometimes get too locked in to try to think of everything as behaving like an oyster.
Yeah.
And there are stuff that is just fundamentally different. Even stuff that you can kind of grow on master's mix, grow it quite well. For example, PFP, it's a radically different mushroom, and like in terms of what its actual ideals are, very, very different.
Yeah, sure.
And then, there's plenty of examples of stuff that, you can't just do a plug and play approach and expect them to like actually want to fruit mushrooms. Just because they myceliate something doesn't mean that they're going to be induced to fruit at all.
No, for sure not. And I think that's like when we end up doing a culture episode and phenotypes and such and exploring different ways to manipulate these things, you start to realize that companies like Amsil or any of the larger sort of manufacturers of cultures and spawn products, they're not genetically modifying these things. None of us are wealthy or intelligent enough to do that. They're just looking for mutations, and then they save the mutations in cryovial storage, and then they see what mutations work with what substrates.
Yeah.
That's all they're doing,
Right.
Whether it's grain-based, substrate-based, whatever, shit-based. It's all experimentation. So
Right. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but there's also just a whole conversation around the point of emphasis for you. Like, you might want to emphasize just having things grow as fast as possible and yield as much as they can. That's the most typical thing.
Yeah.
That's our approach.
Yeah.
But that requires a much different management routine. It's just kind of higher risk, high reward.
Yeah.
To be using master's mix for almost everything.
We're a country that just does one and dones. Like nobody else in the fucking world does that. They fruit multiple bunches.
But you can get, like if you have a more gentle recipe, number one, as we talked about, it's necessary for certain species. But even if it's not necessary for a given species, it can make it a lot easier to have healthy blocks.
Yeah.
And kind of easier, healthier fruit body development, even if it's not as fast or high yielding. So a good example is lion's mane is a notoriously finicky species.
Yeah.
And it becomes really hard to manage and get consistent results from when it's cultivated on master's mix. A lot of people will know about the yellow liquid and all kinds of weird metabolic issues in incubation on such a nutrient rich recipe.
Yeah.
Whereas
so you can dial it back a little bit.
Yeah, if you lower it down a little bit, you can get, it's a little bit slower, but it's going to colonize in a much healthier, more vigorous fashion.
Yeah.
And the fruits are going to more often than not be much more consistently healthy looking.
Yeah. That's true.
That's why you look at, like, for example, looking at like cultivation info from Europe, like say go to Mycelia's website or Sylvan or something.
Yeah.
And they'll talk about their average incubation timelines, and everything's way longer and the average yields are way slower. That's because they have a fundamentally different approach to our crazy American one and done, which it's not to say one's better than the other. It's
but we're running like cowboys and they're like running like scientists. We're like, get it, coach, get it, goddammit. It's gnarly. They're like outrunning rainstorms.
Yeah, no, I remember talking about like our approach to people at Mycelia, and they were just dumbfounded. And they were really impressed when I was showing photos of these like beautiful, gigantic oyster clusters. But I was also describing like how chaotic it all is, and they just couldn't wrap their heads around why we do it that way. You know?
Yeah, it's a strange fucking concept, but we're revolutionizing.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's fun. It's fun to be a cowboy. Hi, Brooks.
Hey.
Did Brooks?
See a cowboy?
Do you know what's happening with Brooks?
Oh, yes.
Okay,
Right.
all right. That's why I stated that.
Right.
Those
I
who
forgot.
know,
Yeah.
know.
I forgot about that.
I gotta call him back. Fucking wild. Is that it? Should we
We could ramble forever, but
Yeah.
that's like, that's the basics of those things. We can always do another episode on this, but that's media, substrate media. Media.
Yada yada.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.